Ukrainian lands are these days the scene of the most mind-blowing Game of Thrones of the century. This struggle between both sides of the war opens a new era in the dusty pages of world history. This period sheds light on how the Ukrainian army dragged the Russians into a swamp, both in the Donbass and on the southern front lines extending to the Crimea. Kiev is carrying out a simultaneous offensive plan to liberate Crimea and disconnect the Donbass region and Putin's army from the borders of both Belarus and Russia. Since the last few weeks, we have witnessed the offensive activities of the Ukrainian army, especially in Zaporizhia, Berdyansk, Melitopol, Crimea, and the Russian cities around this peninsula. What about the latest situation on Ukrainians' eastern front lines? In the last few days, the Ukrainians have been idling the intensity of ground offensive activities on the southern front lines. Moscow perceived this war strategy of the Ukrainian armed forces as a period of pause. Currently, Russian officials were describing the Ukrainian advance on the southern front lines as insufficient. Normally, Russian officials describe the pause of the Ukrainian army in the trenches of the battlefield as a negative situation for Kiev. But we understood from the incredible activity on the eastern front lines that this was a brand new offensive tactic in Kiev in the past days. The Ukrainian army started sudden and harsh offensive activities in the vicinity of Bakhmut, where it took the initiative, which even the Russians didn't expect. The Russians acted to make up for the gaps in these front lines. After Wagner forces withdrew from Bakhmut and its environs, the Russian armed forces dispatched reinforcements to the city of Bakhmut in the positions near the city. But as Ukraine controls both Bakhmut and supply routes close to the city, more than 100,000 Russian soldiers fell into the net of the Ukrainian armed forces on their way to Bakhmut after the withdrawal of Wagner troops from Donbass. The Russian Army's 1st Army, 2nd Army, and pro-Russian Chechen Special Forces are taking place in Bakhmut and its surroundings. There are around 42,000 troops in the Russian 1st Army and 46,000 in the Russian 2nd Army. In addition, the total number of pro-Russian Chechen forces in the region and the 1st Tank Army of the Russian Army and other support units is around 15,000. The Russian 1st and 2nd Army formed for the Luhansk and Donetsk regions has been feeling the power of Ukraine for months after the breathtaking offensive of the Ukrainian forces in both Luhansk and Donetsk. Two regions are operationally besieged, and thus 100,000 Russian soldiers are stuck in the middle of CNM. Soldiers of Russia's 72nd Motor Brigade near Kaliska, south of Bakhmut, were among the units that fell prey to the Ukrainians. If you remember, the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Anna Malior, reported that the last of the Ukrainian forces advanced 1,200 meters towards Kaliska and 1,500 meters towards Kuranivka, south of Bakhmut. Malior also announced that Ukrainian troops still control the southwestern outskirts of Bakhmut, but the most intense clashes are now around the city. Therefore, thousands of Russian soldiers could not pass through this city and reach Bakhmut as the Ukrainian army finally took control of Kaliska. When the Russians failed to supply troops from Kaliska to Bakhmut, the Moscow administration wanted to send reinforcements to the fortress of the war, this time from a different front line. Colonel Sergei Sharavathi, spokesman for Ukraine's eastern forces, announced that a Russian Air Force regiment was transferred from Lyman to Bakhmut, but these units were allegedly under heavy attack by Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians had almost blocked all entrances and exits to Bakhmut while watching the war behind closed doors. Putin began to realize that he had lost. When the gates of hell are closed, we will have to take into account the Russian soldiers who remained inside Bakhmut, because it's estimated that about 50,000 Russian soldiers are fighting in the city of Bakhmut at the moment. In addition to this number, If we consider the Russian reinforcements trying to reach this city from the vicinity of Bakhmut, we can clearly see that a total of 100,000 Russian soldiers are under the blockade of Ukraine. Among the Russian troops who wanted to reach the city of Bakhmut, news continued to come from the front lines in the north of the city. Even though the Ukrainians tried to completely shut down the transportation to the city, the Russians didn't give up and continued to spend their soldiers on transporting them to Bakhmut. Russia's 106th Air Assault Division, located near Markivka, was among the teams moving towards the fortress of the war. This journey, which Kiev called the Death Voyage, was very risky for the soldiers of the 106th Air Assault Division. The reason for this was that the Ukrainians took Barsa back from the Russians and created an effective defense and attack network in the city. For this reason, the soldiers of the 106th Air Assault Division of the Russian Army could not reach the fortress of the war. Bakhmut continued to be of particular importance to both sides. Russia occupied most of the town in early June 2022 after fighting for the town for a year. Ukraine has since attempted to retake the city by encircling it from the north and south. But the current situation of the city has never been more difficult for the Russians. In other words, in Bakhmut, which the Ukrainians are trying to take back in time, it seems that Kiev is now having a say because lastly, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that its forces had seized the strategic initiative in the city of Bakhmut and carried out a large offensive action, forcing the Russians to leave the positions they occupied. US Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley announced that the Ukrainians were advancing to 500 and 1,000 meters per day on the eastern front lines and up to 2,000 meters in some eastern trenches. This is war, and occupied territories cannot be recovered instantly. For this reason, although the progress may seem small to us when we consider the situation, military ammunition levels and possibilities of both sides, the progress of the Ukrainians is quite successful. The most important statements on this subject were made by the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Anna Malaya. Anna Malaya reported that Ukrainian forces recaptured an area of 28.4 kilometers squared last week, bringing the total gain of the counterattack currently to 158 kilometers squared. Ukrainian Army spokesman Sergei Sharavathi said his troops had advanced more than a kilometer against the Russian forces near the eastern city of Bakhmut in recent days. His comments were the latest to signal that the counter-offensive launched by Kiev in early June is making gradual progress. Although Russia's accounts of the conflict in the Bakhmut sector differ from Ukraine's, although the Russians don't accept these explanations, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to show how successful they are, both in Bakhmut and on the front lines near the city. For Ukrainians, one of the main factors in the success of the offensive actions is, of course, Western aid and the modernization of the Ukrainian army's airspace. Every day, thousands of civilian and military drones of the Ukrainian army take off on both sides of the front. These vehicles are reconnaissance attack positions or help commanders coordinate the actions of warriors during battle, according to Kiev. The quantitative advantage of the enemy can be compensated by technological solutions that significantly increase the effectiveness of the army. That's why they believe that the more drones Ukrainian forces have in their airspace, the more they can corner the Russians. Dominating the airspace with UAVs is a fairly simple plan for Kiev, as the Ukrainian armed forces has a very different range of weapons than they had before, February 24, 2022, and now with the military support of the West, the Ukrainian army is at a much better level than it was before the war in terms of airspace and ground attacks. Although we cannot ignore the Western and US support for the Ukrainian military, local Ukrainian military innovation in line with Kiev's plan is also vital to successes against the Russians. Ukrainian IT company Logic 7 creates universal training systems for fire training of Ukrainian military units. The system is a simulator for the military, which allows you to save on the real costs of scarce weapons. The first professional simulation system was created long before the Great War. In 2019, the company developed the first project in the direction of military technology. The war in Ukraine severely eroded the Russian army socio-psychologically. Russian soldiers standing guard on the front lines and mobilized Russian citizens now want this war to end as soon as possible. The escape of Russian soldiers from the front lines due to the recent attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces and their surrender to Ukraine greatly undermined Russian leader Vladimir Putin's invasion plans. In addition, the relatives and friends of the Russian soldiers who are on the front lines both in the Crimean Peninsula and on the territory of Ukraine continue to be included in the mass escape plans due to the deep effects of this war. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are trying to increase their military efforts to turn this situation to their advantage. Due to the negative living conditions of the soldiers and commanders in the Russian army on the front lines and the oppressive attacks of the Ukrainian army, there has been a lot of activity in the regions connecting the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine recently. While ground attack operations continued on eastern Ukrainian front lines such as Bakhmut, airstrikes using missiles and UAVs affected Crimea, Ukraine's southern front lines and port cities. As you know, large mass evacuations continue in Crimea. The situation is also the same in the Kherson region. This region, controlled by Ukraine, is seriously important for both Crimea and port cities such as Berdyansk and Mariupol. One of the factors that was effective in the escape of the Russians from the southern front lines is, of course, the Ukrainian army's turning its offensive axis in this direction. In other words, with the warming of the weather, the intensity of clashes in the eastern Ukraine front lines shifted towards the southern regions of Ukraine, especially in the last few days. Berdyansk has regularly resonated with explosions. Berdyansk, with a population of 110,000, is located on the coast of the Azov Sea and is an important area of the mainland corridor between the Russian Donbass and the Crimea. Russia has long wanted to create a land corridor between these regions and improve the supply of goods and soldiers. That's why Russian soldiers have made great efforts to hold Berdyansk since the beginning of the war. However, the offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces seriously hampered these efforts of the Russians. The other day, Ukrainian forces carried out an incredible offensive operation in the city. Simultaneously, local Telegram channels posted photos capturing the smoke billowing in the sky over occupied Berdyansk. According to Ukrainian sources, the sounds of explosions in Berdyansk came from near the airport. The Russian army used the airfield in Berdyansk as a military base. Later, the municipal military administration confirmed that Ukrainian forces carried out at least 5 attacks on Russian positions in Berdyansk, including the Russian military base at the airport. The fact that Ukrainian forces targeted the city's Russian airport deeply affected Moscow, especially its leader, Vladimir Putin, because the port city of Berdyansk is one of the places that Putin wants to keep in his hands due to its strategic location. According to local sources, Ukrainian forces hit the Russian airfield in Berdyansk with long-range missiles, Storm Shadow. British Storm Shadow ballistic missiles can hit targets up to 300 kilometers away. The headlines after this striking attack were about Russian air defense systems. And these headlines reflected a huge fiasco about Russian defense systems. Thanks to the Storm Shadow attack on the city's airport, the Russian air defense systems were once again proven to be ineffective. At the moment, there has been no official statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense regarding the ongoing attacks. In fact, there were hectic hours in Berdyansk just one day before these attacks. Ukrainian armed forces continued to use Storm Shadow missiles to target Russian troops in occupied Berdyansk. The resorts of Khimik and Vesna, located on the coast of the Sea of Azov, were hit by these missiles. It's claimed that many Russian soldiers were killed after this striking attack because there were command centers and ammunition depots of Russian soldiers in the areas where the attack took place. The Ukrainian army had completely blockaded the city. The first signals of this blockade attempt were already given by Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky. Zelensky made a big promise that he would take back all the occupied cities, including the Crimea, from the Russians. These cities, of course, included the port city of Berdyansk. In fact, the first example of this chain of attacks in Berdyansk already indicated that the city would be surrounded by Ukrainians, starting with the offensive operations on Berdyansk military airport. The Ukrainians carried out their first attacks in this city last week. Ukrainian forces also used Storm Shadow long-range missiles in this offensive operation. Last week, a series of explosions occurred in the temporarily occupied city of Berdyansk. The Department of Strategic Communications of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that the headquarters of the Russian troops was hit. Local Telegram channels announced that at 4 p.m., the city was awakened by a series of explosions. After this attack, it was noted that the city was partially without electricity. Meanwhile, the Russian administration in the city claimed that Berdyansk was hit by Storm Shadow missiles and that Russian air defenses shot down 6 missiles and a 7th fell on the outskirts of the city. The attacks in Berdyansk severely affected Russia's connection with Crimea. In addition, the advances made by the Ukrainians in the city still raise hopes that Berdyansk will be freed from Russian occupation. In economic terms, this city is of vital importance for Ukrainians in the port city. The Ukrainians provided material resources to a large extent with the export of cargo ships before the war started, but the war reduced these incomes and brought the economic activities of the Ukrainians almost to the point of extinction. But the recent attacks in Berdyansk contributed to the Ukrainian plans for domination on the southern front lines. After these offensive operations, the reconstruction of Ukrainian infrastructure will continue along the Sea of Azov. According to many war analysts, these include important ports such as Mariupol and Berdyansk. The reopening of the North Crimean Canal, which carries water from the Dnieper to Crimea, will be another project that will attract attention. The biggest factor for the development of this project is the Storm Shadow missiles used by the Ukrainian army in all these offensive operations. If you remember earlier, the UK confirmed that it's applied Storm Shadow-launched cruise missiles to Ukraine. Ukrainians are also using these missiles perfectly at the moment, while the Ukrainian forces continued their military preparations by using Storm Shadow missiles to achieve these goals. There were heated moments in the city of Mariupol as well as Berdyansk in recent days. Explosions were heard in and around Mariupol in the past days. Initial reports indicated attacks were taking place at multiple locations where Russian occupation forces were stationed. Petro Andriushenko, an advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, reported that the impacts at the Russian-occupied facilities in Yalta and Starokrym caused significant disruptions in various parts of Mariupol. In addition, Petro Andriushenko drew attention to the offensive actions of the Ukrainians against the positions they held in Urivka. It has been reported that the targeted area in Urivka is the Sanyasi camp where Russian military personnel are stationed. According to his information, Andriushenko reported that there were many injured and 4 ambulances were speeding towards the village of Mangush. The town of Gurzif was also attacked. But Andriushenko noted that unlike the situation in Urivka, there was no panic in Nikolsk, too. It turned out that the hits were aimed at a Russian-occupied building, in particular the military commissariat, which served as an accommodation. Reports consistently demonstrated targeted attacks on Russian positions, including those close to airports. In conclusion, all these attacks indicate that Russian forces have recently intensified the deployment of military equipment in Mariupol and Berdyansk. In addition to these, the Russians are building serious defensive fortifications on the peninsula in order not to lose the main strategic center of the war, the Crimea. But developments in Berdyansk, Mariupol, and on southern Ukrainian front lines indicate that a decisive victory for the Ukrainians is already in sight near Crimea. The dead are a lot of updates from the Zaporizhia region here after the Russians launched their offensive operation with the goal of capturing Orikhiv. They quickly realized that they underestimated the capability of the Ukrainians. Ukrainian artillery, which they thought was relocated to the east, opened devastating fire and forced the Russians to completely change their main lines of attack, and especially how these attacks are conducted. As you remember, during the first wave of the Russian offensive operation, the Russians established control over the gray zone areas to get as close to the Ukrainian defense line as possible. And during the second day, the Russians started storming every single settlement. That is part of the original defense line, which did not work out very well. It seems like the Russians counted on two things. Firstly, the Russians likely assumed that by increasing the activity in this dormant direction rapidly, they could catch the Ukrainians off guard and exploit the element of surprise to the fullest. Secondly, the Russians likely assumed that the Ukrainians had decreased the concentration of their forces here in favor of other directions, such as Crimea and Bakhmut, to the point where the Ukrainians were incapable of repelling a massive attack. That is why they opted for such a broad attack with a lot of troops. They didn't think that the Ukrainians had enough troops to save the situation everywhere. And they also did not expect that the Ukrainians still have enough artillery in the region, as almost all artillery brigades were relocated to the east. As it turned out, they underestimated the Ukrainians with respect to both factors, because it turned out that the Ukrainians were not caught by surprise. They had enough men to retain control over all settlements, and they managed to cause the biggest problems for the Russians with their artillery, even though this is exactly what the Ukrainian General Staff reported and showed in the video, where Ukrainian artillery is successfully preventing the Russians from crossing the fields. The same conclusions can be derived from Russian sources as well. The first wave of reports was overly optimistic and suggested that the Russians had taken control over all settlements in one day. The second wave of reports was less enthusiastic and claimed that the fights continued to take place. The fights did not continue to take place, but the Russians were definitely preparing to resume them very shortly. When they resumed their offensive actions, they significantly decreased the scope of their operation and focused just on the outskirts. The last wave of reports is more realistic, and almost all Russian sources confirm that the Russians did not enter any of the villages due to overwhelming artillery fire and distant mining. Right now, the Ukrainians are in full control of the villages from Shcherbaki to Novodanilovka, and the Russians here are conducting a lot of small-scale attacks that are meant to identify Ukrainian fortifications, observation posts, and other positions which they later target with their artillery in order to alleviate the main problems of their infantry. The Russians also engage in intense counter-battery combat when it comes to the western part of the region. Here the Russians continue storming Kamiansky, and there are a lot of conflicting reports. Some reports suggest that the Russians took control over it. Some say that they didn't. But the Ukrainians still left due to intense fire, and some say that there were no changes to the status quo. The only thing that is clear is that the fights there are incredibly heavy when it comes to the eastern part of the region. Here, no party reported any actions, and it looks like Ukrainian fortifications turned out to be too formidable for the Russians to storm them at this stage of the offensive operation. Overall, the fights are once again becoming positional. This is very good news for the Ukrainians because it means that their defense line is intact and the Ukrainians retain tactically advantageous position. That makes it much easier to protect the flanks of Orikhiv.